Beneath the polished surface of international diplomacy, where handshakes are firm and smiles are practiced, the real story is almost never the one being broadcast to the masses. We have become conditioned to hear a headline, absorb the chaotic noise surrounding it, and walk away assuming we have grasped its true meaning. But every so often, a moment of friction arrives that shatters that complacency. It is an episode that forces you to look past the reflection on the water and realize that the visible event is merely a ripple above something far more massive, far more consequential, and far more dangerous lurking in the depths. That is precisely what happened during the sudden, jagged turbulence between Canada and the United States over the procurement of military aircraft. On the evening news, it appeared to be just another dry defense contract dispute, a budgetary disagreement destined to be buried by the next news cycle. But if you listened with intent, if you scrutinized how power was actually being exercised behind the scenes, a much darker narrative emerged. It was not a debate about jets. It was a high-stakes test of national will, a clinical examination of sovereignty under extreme pressure, and a haunting question of how democracies behave when they decide that raw leverage is a more attractive tool than traditional diplomacy. The ultimatum in the room. You might have seen the footage, a U.S. ambassador standing at a podium in Munich, his voice steady, but his message devastating. He wasn't just discussing defense. He was declaring to the world that Canada's entire trade future with the United States now hinged on its willingness to purchase one specific American aircraft. If you blinked, or if you were distracted by the jargon, it might have sounded like a standard policy speech. But if you truly listened to the architecture of his words, it didn't sound like a suggestion. It sounded like an ultimatum. This was the moment the mask slipped. Canada had already moved toward acquiring a batch of F-35s, but its prime minister was doing exactly what a responsible leader in a democracy is supposed to do. He was pausing to consider whether the country might be better served by reassessing that massive commitment. This is the kind of due diligence that governments perform every single day. Yet Washington's response was not a technical argument about performance metrics, nor was it a collaborative discussion about alliance interoperability. Instead, it was a cold, hard reminder that in a relationship as asymmetrical as the one between these two neighbors, choices are often treated as privileges granted by the powerful, rather than sovereign rights owned by the nation. You may have felt deep down that this situation felt larger and more ominous than a simple procurement deal, and you would be right to feel that way. When a superpower insists that its closest allies' trade access depends entirely on a military purchase, it reveals a profound and growing impatience with the very idea that partners should be free to make their own strategic judgments. Let me pull back the curtain and walk you through what officially transpired, because the public version of this story hides just as much as it reveals. The Canadian government had initially drifted toward the F-35, the aircraft that has effectively become the default choice for much of the NATO alliance. However, as legitimate concerns began to mount, concerns about spiraling costs, long-term readiness, and the lack of autonomy over the aircraft's critical internal systems, a counteroffer emerged from Sweden. The Swedish proposal was radical in its simplicity. It promised not just a world-class aircraft, but the birth of a domestic industrial ecosystem in Canada to support it. This alternative alone should have been enough to spark a deep and healthy debate within the halls of Parliament. But before that debate could even reach maturity, the United States signaled that its patience had reached its limit. They made it clear that a failure to proceed with the F-35 would have consequences that would bleed far beyond defense policy, potentially crippling the economic ties that sustain millions of Canadian lives. The architecture of power. When I describe this to you, I don't just want you to hear the words that were spoken. I want you to see the invisible structures of power that were being built and reinforced in that moment. Democracies thrive on the oxygen of voluntary cooperation. They begin to corrode and wither the moment persuasion is replaced by a threat. Now, if you are sitting at home wondering why a dispute over fighter jets should matter to your daily life, let me put it as plainly as possible. Every citizen in every democracy has a personal stake in whether their leaders retain the fundamental freedom to choose what they believe strengthens their nation. Defense procurement might seem like a distant, cold administrative act, but it is the ultimate expression of a nation's soul. It involves your taxes, your jobs, your country's long-term planning, and above all, the sacred principle that a country should equip its military based on its own assessment of its needs, not the preferences of a more powerful friend who happens to live next door. The deeper problem we are facing here is not a question of which aircraft is technically superior in a dogfight. The problem is whether the institutional norms, the unwritten rules of respect and etiquette that have governed global alliances for decades, are being eroded under the heavy weight of impatience and geopolitical anxiety. To truly understand how we arrived at this fractured moment, we have to look at the slow, steady buildup that preceded it. For years, Canada has wrestled with the agonizing task of modernizing its Air Force while trying to balance fiscal responsibility with the desire for national autonomy. The F-35 promised cutting-edge, world-beating capability, but it came with significant unanswered questions about operational sovereignty. Sweden's offer, by contrast, promised a completely different model, one rooted in genuine partnership and the empowerment of domestic manufacturing. These were not radical ideas, they were genuine policy choices, the exact kind of high-stakes decisions that responsible governments are supposed to debate in the open light of day. However, the international system has grown increasingly hostile toward nuance. Great powers today increasingly view any form of hesitation as a sign of defiance, and they view defiance as a behavioral problem that needs to be corrected. That is the toxic environment in which Canada suddenly found itself, and it is why this specific moment deserves far more scrutiny than it ever received in the sensationalist headlines. What fascinates me most about this crisis is the specific mechanism by which it unfolded. Normally, even the most intense disagreements between states are negotiated quietly behind closed doors, allowing technical committees and seasoned defense analysts to weigh the trade-offs without the heat of the spotlight. But in this instance, the message was delivered loudly, publicly, and almost theatrically, as though the goal was to ensure that no one, from the halls of power to the person on the street, could possibly miss the intent. This was not simply a trusted ambassador urging a partner to consider the needs of the alliance. This was the explicit invocation of economic pressure to forcibly shape a military decision. When you strip away the layers of diplomatic phrasing and polite jargon, what remains is a striking and naked assertion: choose the aircraft we prefer or prepare to risk the consequences. The gravity of the system. I want you to see how truly unusual and jarring that is in a relationship that has been characterized for decades by mutual respect and accommodation. It isn't that such pressure has never been applied before. Power always seeks to influence, but it is being applied now more openly, more bluntly, and with a staggering lack of concern for how it appears to the citizens of both nations. As we begin to peel back the layers of this situation, the incentives involved become clearer, though they are no less troubling. Militaries operate on incredibly long timelines, and the massive corporations that manufacture defense systems operate on even longer ones. A program as vast and expensive as the F-35 has become more than just a weapons platform. It is a sprawling economic ecosystem. It is a massive network of subcontractors, assembly lines, maintenance facilities, and political interests spanning several nations. This creates a powerful gravitational pull. Countries that buy into the system are expected to remain loyal at all costs, and countries that even suggest reevaluating their position are treated as existential threats to the stability of that entire ecosystem. You might be tempted to think of this as merely commerce mixed with a bit of geopolitics, but it is actually a reminder that large, complex systems eventually develop their own instincts for self-preservation. Once billions of dollars and decades of policy momentum are set in motion, any form of hesitation becomes an unwelcome disruption. That is the volatile climate Canada stepped into the moment it began re-examining its purchase. It explains why the reaction from Washington seemed so much more forceful and aggressive than the technical situation actually required. The actors at the very center of this story deserve our scrutiny, not in a punitive or angry sense, but in the responsible, sober spirit of democratic accountability. A U.S. ambassador does not stand on a world stage and make such statements lightly. He speaks with the full weight of his government behind him, especially when he is speaking at a major global security conference. His message was not an improvised mistake. It reflected a calculated decision that public pressure was a more effective tool than private diplomacy. Whether that decision was wise is a question that will haunt both nations long after this specific episode fades from the news. On the Canadian side, the Prime Minister was faced with the unenviable and crushing task of balancing vital national interests against the heavy expectations of a massive ally, all while navigating a domestic political environment where any perceived confrontation with the United States carries enormous risk. If you sense the tension in this story, you aren't imagining it. This is exactly what it looks like when long-standing alliances encountered the brutal strain of divergent priorities. As this saga unfolded, the debate over the aircraft themselves took on a heavy, symbolic quality. It was no longer just a question of radar cross-sections or cost per flight hour. It became a fundamental question of who actually holds the pen when a nation attempts to write its own defense posture. The moral weight of choice. This is precisely where the Swedish alternative began to gain significant moral weight. It represented more than just another plane. It represented a completely different model of what a partnership could look like. It was a model that promised real technology transfer and domestic production, rather than a state of permanent dependency on foreign-controlled software and systems. For many Canadians, that promise spoke to a deep-seated desire for greater economic resilience and national pride. For others, it signaled a much-needed return to the principle that allies should support one another's decisions, not dictate them. And for many viewers like you, it reframed the entire issue. Instead of asking which jet could fly faster or turn tighter, the more urgent and unsettling question became, is Canada even being allowed to hold this debate at all without facing economic retaliation? We cannot discuss this situation without acknowledging the wider, more frightening implications for international norms. Democracies rely on a certain level of etiquette, a shared fundamental understanding that persuasion and consensus, not coercion and threats, should be the primary guides for relations among allies. When that etiquette is shattered, even for reasons that seem strategically sound in the short term, it creates precedents that are incredibly difficult to unwind. Other nations are watching this. Smaller allies are taking meticulous notes. A message is being broadcast across the globe that cooperation with a superpower may come with strings that are never fully disclosed until the exact moment of a disagreement. Once that perception takes root, the trust that holds alliances together begins to erode in ways that no trade deal, no joint press conference, and no amount of diplomatic smoothing can quickly repair. You might be wondering if this is an overstatement, but the true health of an alliance is never found in the easy celebratory moments. It is found in the contentious ones. This moment was deeply contentious, and it revealed pressure points that had been quietly and dangerously accumulating for years. Beyond the high-level diplomatic theater, there is a profound human dimension that we cannot afford to overlook. Defense procurement decisions affect real communities, real workers, real engineers, and the brave service members who will eventually rely on these aircraft in the harshest conditions imaginable. It affects the taxpayers whose hard-earned money funds these massive decisions, and it affects young Canadians who will grow up in a defense environment entirely shaped by the choices being made today. When you strip away the layers of geopolitics and grand strategy, what remains are real people whose lives will be fundamentally influenced by whether their country chooses dependency or autonomy, imported technology or domestically cultivated expertise, the muscle of sovereignty. These people, the factory workers, the pilots, the families, rarely make the front-page headlines, but they are the ones who carry the ultimate consequences of decisions made in polished conference halls an ocean away. And if you are among them, if your job, your safety, or your future is touched by these choices, you deserve a process that is guided by clear principle rather than external pressure. This brings us to the deeper institutional insight that this entire episode exposes to the light. Modern democracies are often praised for their intricate systems of checks and balances, but those checks only operate when leaders are willing to withstand external influence and stand their ground. Sovereignty is not a static condition. It is a muscle that must be exercised to remain strong. When a country feels compelled to adjust its core policies simply because a more powerful neighbor threatens economic consequences, that muscle weakens. When a country resists, even at the cost of some short-term discomfort, that muscle grows stronger. What Canada is experiencing right now is a test of its constitutional posture. Will it absorb the pressure and continue down a path it may no longer believe is optimal for its future? Or will it assert its fundamental right to evaluate alternatives, even if doing so displeases a partner that has grown accustomed to compliance? As I follow this story to its conclusion, I keep returning to the vital idea that alliances are at their strongest when each member feels secure enough to disagree. That is the great paradox that few people in power seem willing to acknowledge. Uniformity is not a sign of strength. It is often a sign of imbalance. True partnership requires the room for autonomy, even when that autonomy leads to choices that the more powerful partner would not have made themselves. In this case, the insistence that the F-35 was the only acceptable option narrowed that space dramatically. It reframed a legitimate and responsible policy review as an act of disloyalty. It treated a routine, common-sense cost-benefit analysis as if it were a geopolitical provocation. When you, as an engaged citizen, see such redefinitions happening in real time, it is worth pausing to consider what habits of governance and diplomacy are being normalized for the future. Much of the tension in this story revolves around systems that were ostensibly designed to integrate allies, but which in practice often limit their independence. These complex modern platforms often come with incredibly sophisticated software that remains under the total control of the producing nation. Maintenance schedules, spare part supplies, and critical operational updates flow through digital networks that do not reside in the purchasing country. While this creates undeniable efficiency and interoperability, it also creates a rigid hierarchy of control. When Canada's leaders looked at those systems and asked whether they truly wanted their future Air Force to function only with the ongoing blessing of another capital, they were asking a question rooted in deep institutional prudence: the collision of technology and independence. When the United States responded to that prudence with escalating pressure, it signaled that the question itself was unwelcome. You can see how easily this dynamic becomes self-reinforcing and dangerous. The more a country seeks a measure of autonomy, the more its partner interprets that desire as a form of resistance or even hostility. If this sounds familiar to you, it is because history is overflowing with examples where technology and sovereignty collide. Nations have always understood that the tools they rely on for their defense ultimately shape the freedom they possess. An aircraft is not just a collection of metal and composite material. It is a complex system of permissions, dependencies, and long-term obligations. When Canada weighed the Swedish offer, it was considering whether it wanted not only a plane, but a kind of industrial citizenship. That offer included domestic production, the genuine transfer of knowledge, and the ability to maintain and upgrade the aircraft without having to ask for foreign approval every single time. You can imagine how incredibly appealing that would be for a mid-sized power committed to maintaining its own independent defense infrastructure. And you can also imagine exactly why a larger ally would see such independence as a complicating factor in an already complex alliance structure. In analyzing where the responsibility lies, it is essential to be fair. The United States is not acting in a vacuum. It faces real and mounting strategic pressures. It is navigating a world in which adversaries are growing more assertive, and it naturally wants its allies to align as closely as possible with its vision for collective defense. From Washington's perspective, uniformity offers a sense of stability and predictability. but a stability that is achieved through pressure rather than genuine consensus tends to be brittle and prone to breaking. Canada, for its part, must balance its own sovereign needs against the very real expectations that come with sharing a massive border with one of the most powerful nations on Earth. Neither side in this dispute is operating with malicious intent, but both are navigating powerful incentives that are pulling them toward conflict. And you, watching this unfold from the outside, can see how these incentives reveal the fragility of international cooperation the moment interests begin to diverge even slightly. The consequences of this moment extend far beyond this one particular procurement deal. If Canada chooses to assert its autonomy and accept a period of temporary trade friction, it will signal to the entire world that mid-sized democracies can still make independent decisions even under immense pressure. If it yields, other nations may read the outcome as confirmation that in moments of tension, sovereignty is ultimately negotiable. The watching world includes countries currently weighing their own military purchases, their own partnerships, and their own tolerance for dependence on others. A legacy for the next generation. What happens in the quiet offices of Ottawa will echo in capitals thousands of miles away from North America. It will shape not only the global defense markets, but the very nature of diplomatic expectations for decades to come. At the same time, we must never lose sight of the human story. The engineers whose careers would be defined by building aircraft domestically, the pilots who would be tasked with flying these machines in the freezing, vast arc of the Canadian North, and the communities that stand to gain or lose massive economic opportunities. These are not abstract or theoretical considerations. When leaders bargain about billions of dollars in international leverage, it is tragically easy to forget that behind every invoice and every contract is a real person whose livelihood is tied to the outcome. It is even easier to overlook the long-term impact on a rising generation of citizens who will have to live within the strategic choices being made right now. If you have ever wondered whether the dry world of geopolitics can touch the fabric of your everyday life, this is the example you should keep in mind. Decisions made in sterile committee rooms shape the horizons of real people. All of this leads us into a much deeper reflection on the very architecture of our democratic systems. Sovereignty is often invoked as a grand principle, but in reality it functions as a daily practice. It depends on a series of choices, on the willingness of leaders to endure short-term discomfort for the sake of long-term independence. It depends on citizens who understand that autonomy often requires sacrifice, and it depends on partners who appreciate that respect is the only stable currency of an alliance. When those conditions begin to weaken, the entire system begins to drift towards something unrecognizable. What we are watching now is not just a dispute over aircraft. It is a fundamental test of whether the institutions and norms that support democratic self-governance are as durable as we have always believed them to be. As we reach the end of this story, I find myself thinking deeply about how democracies actually learn and grow. They do not learn from easy triumphs or comfortable routines. They learn from these jarring moments when power is exerted in unexpected and uncomfortable ways. They learn when familiar relationships suddenly reveal unfamiliar and jagged edges. What happened between Canada and the United States over this aircraft dispute was, in its essence, a profound civics lesson disguised as a diplomatic quarrel. It showed how easy it is, even for the oldest and closest of allies, to slip into patterns of behavior that resemble coercion rather than cooperation. The choice of philosophy. It showed how essential it is for democratic leaders to remember that true legitimacy flows not from the application of pressure, but from the gathering of consent. If you felt a quiet, nagging sense of unease as this episode unfolded, you were recognizing that a vital line was being blurred. The institutional question, the one that carries the most weight for our future, is whether this specific moment becomes a permanent precedent or a much-needed turning point. If it becomes a precedent, then allies will increasingly treat one another as mere instruments rather than true partners, using economic leverage to force military decisions and expecting compliance as the only acceptable response. That would make our global alliances more transactional, less principled, and ultimately less secure, reducing them to a series of cold bargains rather than a community of shared values. If it becomes a turning point, then nations will take this opportunity to reassess not only how they negotiate with one another, but how they protect the sacred decision-making space that sovereignty requires. That reassessment would actually strengthen, rather than weaken, the fabric of international cooperation by grounding it in mutual respect. For Canada, the choice it faces is not merely between one jet and another. It is a choice between two competing philosophies of national defense. One philosophy relies on integration so deep and so total that national autonomy becomes conditional on the neighbor's approval. The other philosophy places a much higher value on domestic capability and self-reliance, even if that path requires more patience, more investment, and a greater degree of diplomatic resilience. Neither path is simple, and neither path is without significant risk. But when citizens evaluate these choices, they are not just evaluating pieces of hardware. They are evaluating who truly holds the authority over the tools that defend their country. If you live in any democracy, you know how precious that authority is and how easily it can be allowed to erode if it is left unexamined. The human beings caught within this high-pressure moment deserve to be seen and understood. The public servants who must interpret conflicting signals from allies, the policymakers who must decide if temporary economic pain is worth the price of long-term sovereignty, the workers whose industries hang in the balance, and the pilots whose very safety depends on the aircraft that eventually emerges from this debate. These are not theoretical characters in a geopolitical drama. They are citizens whose futures are being forged by the decisions made today. The deeper question. When we acknowledge their stake in this, we remember that the true purpose of democratic governance is not to please powerful neighbors or satisfy international markets, but to serve the people who live, work, and dream under the national flag. And so we end exactly where we began, with the sober recognition that the headline is only the surface. Beneath the loud quarrel over aircraft platforms and defense contracts lies a much deeper and more urgent question about how democracies maintain their independence in an era of intense interdependence. That question will not be answered by a single signature on a contract or a single diplomatic gesture at a summit. It will be answered by whether nations continue to believe that sovereignty is a value worth preserving, even when preserving it carries a significant cost. In that sense, Canada's dilemma is not Canada's alone. It belongs to every country that has ever wondered whether partnership requires total conformity or whether it allows for the messy, beautiful reality of genuine self-determination. As you think about this story, I hope you carry with you the understanding that the future of democratic cooperation depends not on perfect unanimity, but on unwavering respect. Allies can disagree without fracturing. They can debate without resorting to threats. And they can build institutions that encourage autonomy rather than fear it. Whether this episode ultimately strengthens or weakens those ideals is something we will only learn in the years ahead. But your attention, your engagement, and your willingness to look past the surface of the headlines already place you ahead of the story rather than behind it. If this conversation helped you see the underlying structures that shape these international disputes, I hope you will stay engaged with these issues. They will not become simpler as time goes on, but together we can think about them more clearly with the patience and the seriousness they require. Our civic life is at its strongest when we examine it together, looking beneath the ripples to see the powerful currents that are truly moving our world.